unions. These are blue collar people who are relying on these pensions to take them through retirement because there is going to be no social security by the time they get there. When you're living in this high velocity, low interest rate environment like what we've been living in the United States for so long, they're going to start thinking to themselves, man, maybe we should have owned a single ounce of gold.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vierra, part of the outreach team of Silver Bullion here in Singapore, where we want to help you truly secure your wealth. Jp Cortez, Executive Director for the Sound Money Defense League, joins us today. The Sound Money Defense League is a nonpartisan national public policy organization working to restore sound money at the state and federal levels. JP is also the publisher for the Sound Money Index, and we're delighted to have JP join us once again today. Time to saddle up and silver up for JP Cortez. JP, welcome back to SBTV. How are you doing?
Patrick, I'm great, man. Great to be back on with you.
Glad to have you back on. JP, can you give us updates that you'd like to share from the Sound Money Defense League? And I understand the organization is celebrating its 10th anniversary.
That's exactly right. 10 years here of sound money advocacy, advocating for pro gold and silver legislation at the state and federal level. And I'm happy to say that in our 10th year of existence, we've also had our most successful legislative season of the year, or rather of our history. In 2024, there were 8 successful legislative projects that we worked on. These are projects that have eliminated the sales tax of precious metals on the purchase, eliminated the capital gains tax when you sell the metal or when you use it. We worked on legislation to empower state treasurers to invest state funds in physical gold. In the case of Utah, you may have heard the news earlier this year. Utah's Governor Cox signed legislation into law empowering the state and designating specifically the funds in which the state is allowed to invest physical gold onto its state's balance sheet. That was a $180 million investment that was approved by the legislature, and that's expected to be made soon. So the treasurers themselves states are bolstering their reserves with gold and silver. And then there were legislation as well to reaffirm gold and silver as money, as a legal tender. Anti-CBDC legislation to ensure that CBDCs can't be foisted upon a given state's population. So it's been an incredible year, and it's been the culmination of all of the years that have come before it. Last year, I believe there were six successful projects. The year before that, there were 4. The year before that, there were 3. So it has been a slow and steady build into, what is the undeniable recognition of sound money as actual money. Today, inflation is, harming more people than it has before in a long time. People are having a hard time affording, food, groceries, the medicine, transportation, energy, and these costs are unsustainable for the American family. The myth of the resilient consumer is exactly that. It is indeed a myth. Right? There are so many metrics you can look at that show that the rosy picture that's being painted by economists and pundits who are telling you that the United States economy is in great shape, all of that is just noise. If you look a little deeper, if you dig deeper, you'll see that credit card debt is higher for the U.S. households than it has been, I believe, in history. We're seeing that household savings is lower now than when it was after it peaked during the height of the COVID years. In 2020, Americans had the highest savings they'd had since the metric had been recorded. And now, not only are we past the line that we were at in 2020, we are down below it. We've gone further into debt as Americans. People taking on, 28% interest rate charges on credit cards because they have no other means through which to afford basic necessities. So sound money is more of an imperative now than it ever has been. And fortunately, on top of the 8 successful state legislative projects that we've had going on this year, there have been a number of federal bills introduced as well. Thomas Massie introducing Audit the Fed bill, Congressman Mooney from West Virginia reintroducing legislation that would federally eliminate capital gains taxes on gold and silver. So we're seeing a real rebirth and an undeniable movement of the ball forward when it comes to sound money.
With Thomas Massey and the audit of the Fed, some people they say end the Fed, all these things. Do you think we're ever going to get anywhere with the Fed? At least the audit, which Congressman Massey is pushing for.
If I'm being completely honest, I'm not necessarily hopeful about any piece of federal legislation making its way through the process and eventually being signed into law by President Biden or whoever, or even President Trump, whoever is in power, whoever's administration that is. I'm not necessarily sure that the powers that be want that. On paper anyway, the Federal Reserve is a private institution, not controlled by the federal government. And I think that, bigger, more important than auditing the Fed, though auditing the Fed, I think, is a worthy cause, a worthy mission to carry on, because, you hear reports of, the Federal Reserve or the Treasury in any given year misplacing millions of billions of dollars that are just completely unaccounted for. And there has to be some sort of investigative, process that happens. There has to be some sort of regular audit that happens. But I think if that ever is to come to fruition, I think that what you'd see is that you'd see the steam behind this issue fall for a generation. Because the truth is, I don't believe that audit would show anything. The audit would show exactly what the government officials would want us to show. And then for 10 years, they would point to that audit and say, look, there's nothing going on. You guys are conspiracy theories. You're kooks. You guys don't know what you're talking about. You're yelling at clouds. And so I think politically, strategically, getting the audit of the Fed is less important than, for example, Congressman Mooney's bill to introduce a process that would audit America's gold holdings. To me, that would be more impactful. Allegedly, according to official government reports, America's gold holdings are held in the United States Bullion Depository, held in Fort Knox at the Army base in Kentucky. But actually last month was the 50th anniversary of the last public audit that was ever done on Fort Knox. At Money Metals Exchange, Matthew Cortez actually wrote a great article about this, where he examined that, it was 50 years ago to that day that they opened the vault doors and they let in congressmen and they let in camera crews and they showed them whole walls full of gold. But notably, in that, process, there was not a single assaying of a bar of gold. There was not a single matching of serial numbers. There was no weighing. There was no testing. There was no actual confirmation that, one, that gold is actually gold and it's actually there, but maybe more importantly, that gold is not encumbered. The gold might be in Fort Knox. It might not be. I don't know. But let's say it is. The bigger question at that point becomes, okay, now who owns it? It might be in the United States vault, but is it pledged as collateral in some sort of agreement? Has it been swapped or leased? Does the IMF hold or own any of it? Whose gold is it actually? And so there is a massive push to examine, take a closer look at America's gold reserves, because the US dollar is slowly losing. People are internationally and domestically, confidence is being lost in the US dollar. And you can see that, of course, in the macro sort of global arena. We're talking about it a lot now. The idea of dedollarization is something we've been hearing about a lot recently. And I think understandably so, right? If you were an outside country and you're watching the United States sanction its way across the world in order to help its friends and to harm its enemies, even a potential ally of the United States might see that and say, hey, wait a second. That one central power has way too much power to put their finger on the scales. So now look, Russia's being kicked out of the SWIFT system, assets are being seized, and people around the world are starting to say, hey, wait a second. Giving the US dollar the global reserve power is an immense and awesome power, and the stewards of the dollar have done a very poor job of maintaining its purchasing power, of course, but also its stability internationally as a neutral money. it is so obviously a weaponized and political tool now that we're seeing more and more news all the time now of increased central bank holdings. You're seeing, of course, the talk of Russia increasing its central bank holdings, Turkey increasing central bank holdings. Just in the last 2 days, I've seen 2 articles saying that Tanzania yesterday was increasing its central bank holdings. And then this morning, Hungary increased by 15 tons, more than 15 tons, their central bank gold holdings. So internationally, we're seeing people start to hedge against the dollar. People are starting to look for alternatives to a global money without any counterparty risk. And the issue is not just that we're seeing it internationally. You know, of course, America's enemies, quote unquote, China, Russia, it is very easy to understand why they might want or seek an alternative. But even Americans' allies are starting to wonder this. And importantly, even internally in the United States, individuals, of course, are buying more and more gold and silver. You know, but the Costco phenomenon is a microcosm of what's happening in this space. People being able to more easily, more quickly acquire gold and silver is a sign of the times, right? And so it of course, individuals are developing and they're reestablishing, going back onto their own personal gold standard. But Patrick, it's bigger than that because it's states themselves now too. You know, Utah looking into buying $180 million in order to protect or to bolster its state savings is, you know, the canary in the coal mine. How many other states, how many other institutions, and how many other individuals are going to look at the dollar and say, hey, wait, we have way too much exposure to the dollar. You know, as the dollar continues to lose confidence, as our political betters continue to zap the purchasing power away of America's money, more and more people are going to continue to look for these alternatives.
Pretty interesting because at this point in time, you know, with what we saw in Walmart and Costco about a year ago, bargain stores selling gold and silver and not being able to keep them on the shelves or in stock. What does this really say to you when you can buy a pack of underwear and the next aisle over buy a few ounces of gold and silver?
I think it's a sign of the times. You know, for a long time, gold and silver has been relegated to coin shops, or, you know, if you want to go into a pawn store, a pawn shop to pick up a couple silver eagles, you might go to a real authorized coin store and go to a dedicated brick and mortar institution that has coins and historic memorabilia. And then, of course, with the internet, you had the advent of these internet retailers. You know, you could simply go online and, you know, that serves as a way to get around some of these taxes. If you're in a state without the sales tax, if you're in a state with the sales tax on precious metals, you would simply go online and have your metals delivered to a depository in Idaho, and you would get around that sales tax. But as we're seeing all of this stuff happen, right? Because all of this stuff is happening at the same time. We're seeing the dollar slowly but surely continue to die. Confidence being lost in the dollar as a monetary tool, as far as like globally, the way it affects foreign policy, but also as a store of value. People are waking up in the morning saying, hey, wait, my dollar used to go further when I went to the store, and that's not the case anymore. Something's going on. And people are starting to ask themselves these questions. Hey, wait, why does my dollar lose value? Wait, what do you mean that the Federal Reserve's stated purpose is to devalue the money by 2% every year? Why is that a good thing? You know, and so I think these are all questions that no one has ever really thought of, in part because the economics profession is one that has been captured by experts. You know, the PhD economists that staff the Federal Reserve will gladly tell you that what we need to be chasing is aggregate demand, and that high velocity is a good thing, and that savings are a bad thing. But of course, we know this to be completely backwards. Savings is ultimately what allows an economy and a society to grow and to prosper. Having a stable money where you can save your wealth for future consumption later, and then you can spend that consumption in infrastructure, in schools, in hospitals, in all of the things that you need to increase living standards. That is ultimately what makes a society thrive. Having a stable money, it is a necessary condition for the flourishing of a society. And we know that. And people who have studied money, people who have known gold and silver have been money for thousands of years know that. And it wasn't until 1913 when the Federal Reserve was established, 1933 when FDR confiscated gold, and then, of course, 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window, officially severing any tie that gold had to the U.S. Federal Reserve note. It's only recently in history that the technocrats and the gold standard was replaced by a PhD standard. And, the experts will constantly tell you, no, look, the CPI is up. GDP is up. They're telling you, look at our graphs. Look at what we're showing you. If you do this really complex calculation and then you subtract housing and energy and food and all of the basic necessities that you need to live your life, the chart shows that your life is actually doing fine. And it's very Orwellian. It's the do not believe your eyes, do not believe your experience when you walk into a grocery store. Instead, look at our chart. It's telling you that CPI is going up and that Americans are better off now than they were over the last 2 years. It's soulless, and it really speaks to the dichotomy between the life and the experience that experts, that economists, that money managers, that politicians live, and the actual lived experience of people in rural Appalachia, or people in Lincoln, Nebraska, or people, in the outskirts of Salem, Oregon. There's such huge disparity between the real life implications of these policies and, what trickles down to humans, to people, to our neighbors being unable to afford basic things.
I think most people out here, we are already seeing now the undeniable truths that mainstream media is not really reflective of Main Street. These two are totally different and getting more widely apart as each day goes by. But I want to touch on something. We mentioned de-dollarization, and I read that coming out of Moscow, they're saying that Russia is looking to budget more allocation for gold, silver, platinum, and palladium. It, the world gets it, JP. The world gets it. The death of the dollar, de-dollarization, the removal of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. The world wants to have a liquid asset such as precious metals. Why is the US seemingly so far behind or stubborn with this? I mean, particularly on the federal level, let's say.
I think stubborn is the perfect way to put it. I think that America at this point is a country that at one point had maybe the strongest monetary unit in history. A US dollar fully backed by gold. Behind the gold was the full faith and confidence of the United States, a burgeoning economy, what would grow to be the greatest economy in the world. And the monetary unit that represented that was the most powerful, most confided in, most trusted, strongest monetary unit at that time. And that's why it was dubbed the global reserve currency. And after that, through the actions of politicians who politicized the dollar, through the actions of what would become a global hegemon, fighting wars all over the country, wars of choice. It's through its own actions that the US dollar faltered. It's through the own actions that the US dollar eventually had that connection to gold severed, and then will eventually die like all paper monies do. So it's not a question of the actions of foreign adversaries. It's not about Putin. It's not about the CEO of your local grocery store. It's not about, all of these things that politicians are pointing their fingers and blaming, other parties for their faults so as to obfuscate the truth, which is that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. There's too much money chasing too few goods and services. And when that happens, the purchasing power of each individual unit will go down. This is a very simple concept. And I think that one of the things I've been thinking about recently is about how for a long time, I actually truly believe that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you were to have asked someone to explain what inflation was, they could have given you a basic understanding of like, oh, it's just too much. It's just basic principles of dilution, right? You have wine, and if you add a bunch of water, you're diluting the wine, so now you have less wine. Even though you may have more in total, you have less wine. And this is sort of an elementary concept that many of us understood for a long time. And it wasn't until it was really politicized that definitions changed. And all of a sudden, words that used to mean something don't mean that anymore. And we've seen that happen throughout politics here recently several times. You know, there are a bunch of examples culturally of that. Racism has been redefined. Power has been redefined. Plagiarism is one that was redefined with that Harvard scandal. So these words are changing in real time. And what we knew to be the case for so long is just been thrown by the wayside. And a big part of that is having a monopoly on money is debatably the greatest power that a country can have. It empowers them so much to do literally whatever they want to do. Giant domestic programs that are essentially Ponzi schemes in the form of retirement systems here domestically, wars overseas in places that most Americans can't find on a map. This is all a product of a printer being able to go unchecked. And that's why sound money is so important, because it restricts, it shackles a government that would otherwise spend recklessly. They're moving slowly because they have all the power. They have the US dollar, the US Federal Reserve note, which they used as a cudgel for decades. It is a weapon. It's a baton that they use to punish their enemies with. And so they don't see this as a risk, and they don't see, when you're so high up in your ivory tower as the global reserve currency, you can't necessarily assess the risks that are coming along underneath. And we're seeing those day to day. We're seeing talks about BRICS currencies. We're talking about gold back. Zimbabwe had that ZIG currency that was backed by gold, allegedly. Of course, we're seeing central bank gold holdings. So all of these alternatives are sprouting up, and it's not by accident. This is the market working in response to a politicized money. To be sure, I think that an important thing to note is that I'm not necessarily bullish or hopeful that a gold-backed currency that originates in another country, or even in this country, frankly, will displace the dollar or will survive long-term. The reason for that is because establishing a gold standard relatively is pretty easy. You can peg it if you want to, that you can establish a gold standard. Maintaining a gold standard, however, is a totally different story that requires intense and extreme fiscal discipline and low time preference. And the truth is that politicians, modern politicians, domestically and abroad, that is not their strong suit. So, anyone can establish a gold-backed currency. This Zimbabwe ZIG that we talked about, that was established earlier this year, that was gold-backed, it came out last week that they're already devaluing that. So more important, right? So you can establish a gold currency, but politicians, ideally, we're establishing institutions that can't be thwarted by expedient politicians.
Right. I was going to ask you something along those lines, because when the gold standard was, let's just say gold was removed, gold standard was removed. Inflation, we saw inflation rise. That opened the door for never-ending wars with the ability to just continue to print money. But I was going to ask, you kind of answered it here, though. In your opinion, is it fair to say sound money equals sound policy and no sound money equals no sound policy?
I think that's probably a little too reductive. In my opinion, the truth is that sound money acts as a shackle, as guardrails against a big government. But that doesn't change human instinct and human behavior. And I think the nature of giving someone arbitrary power, which is to empower a politician, the nature of giving someone that power to rule and reign over others will always be abused. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so politicians always need to be checked. So it's important to be studious and diligent, because politicians, even the ones that are good, even the ones that will tell you that they like sound money or that they like what you like, behind closed doors and in the shadows, they're working on their deals. They're working on expanding their power, and sound money constricts their power. So no, I don't think sound money is necessarily a a cure to all of the world's problems. I think that you will still have savage politicians who look at humans as tax cows, or they look at land as potential land to grab, as part of a territorial game, as to expand their power. I think that that will always be the nature of politicians. And so it's important to create institutions and structures to provide checks to that, right? The American system was founded with the understanding that humans are flawed, and given man's propensity to sin, you need to have checks and balances in place. That was the entire reason behind the way the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. government was built. And gold and silver were such an important part of limiting the power of a government that was going to expand, that was always going to expand. So gold and silver play an important role, but the individuals themselves, too, have to be diligent about holding their politicians' feet to the fire.
You got me at politicians are savage. I'm like, I can't get off that. You know, it's so many family show here. I won't go too much into that. But you know, you kind of touched on the BRICS. You know, coming out with the gold-backed currency, which they're calling the unit. JP, what do you foresee happening with especially commodities? Let's say like oil. I mean, would the petrodollar, I mean, is it here? Is it not here? I know it's kind of going away, but it would almost instantly cease to exist if oil producing nations move to accept the BRICS unit.
I think that so we're seeing a lot of that play out now, right? Where people are starting to exchange in things to final settlement in things other than the US dollar, be it gold, be it oil. And I think that as we're seeing, this is just the beginning of what will continue to percolate. The countries themselves starting to say, no, we don't want dollar-denominated assets. We would rather trade in things, one, that in many cases that they already have natural resources in their own countries, but two, that they don't have any counterparty risk. The counterparty risk is so huge, and it's a misunderstood, a unappreciated part when we talk about money, because what makes gold and silver compared to fiat money, one of their most big and important differences is that there is no counterparty risk. I don't have to trust the whims of politicians to know that my gold is worth whatever it's worth on the market that day. The fiat money is money by executive order. It's money by government edict. Excuse me. And gold and silver are obviously not that. So we're seeing BRICS countries, of course, and it's not just limited to BRICS countries. Like I mentioned before, even United States allies could be watching this happen over the last several years or the last several decades, watching the United States sanction its way across the world and saying, I never want to fall on the wrong side of that. I'm an ally now, but what if one day I'm not? And so they're building the infrastructure to make sure that they can transact in the case of them wanting to fully move away from the dollar. And the dollar is doing it to itself. You know, when the history books are written, that's what should be said, that it was an abuse of power by a hegemon. It wasn't the foreign actions. It wasn't foreign actors. It wasn't anything internal. It was our political leaders that politicized our money so much that it eventually died. And, you know, I think we've talked about this before, but money is such an important part of the way we socially interact with one another and the world around us. Right? Second to language, there is no bigger communicative tool that human beings use to peacefully associate with one another. And so it's very important to make sure that those signals that money provides are not being obfuscated or politicized. It's important that they're not being manipulated. And that's ultimately what central banks do. That's ultimately what the Federal Reserve has been doing since at least the 1970s. Before then, really since its advent in 1913. And I think what we're going to see more of this, this BRICS currency, which I believe there was supposed to be something in October that was announced. This BRICS currency is only going to be one of many, as many seek alternatives to the US dollar. And I have to be honest, if you look at it, not through a nationalistic view, but through a global view, a bifurcated monetary system isn't a bad thing. In fact, I want a bifurcated monetary system. I want a trifurcated, I want a quadfurcated monetary system. I want an entire market open for money. I want a market for money. The same way when you go to the store and you look for deodorant, there are like 19 different types of deodorant you can have that all have different properties, and you can choose the one you want. And ultimately, that's what markets do. They provide choice, and it's through that choice that we can ultimately determine what's best, what has the best properties, and what doesn't. A market for money is a good thing. That's a very Hayekian idea. F.A. Hayek, Nobel Prize winning economist, who wrote a book literally called The Denationalization of Currency. There's no good reason why money has to be tied to some geographical capital building. There's no reason why money has to be provided by a government. The same reason that your shoes are all provided by markets, the soups that you eat are all provided by markets, the umbrellas that you use to cover yourself outside when it's raining, the clothes you wear, all of these things are provided by markets because we know that markets provide the highest quality goods at the lowest possible price, and they give us choice. It accounts for the fact that all of us are different individuals with different desires and different means and different needs. So a money should have that same type of choice system. If I want my money to preserve its purchasing power over the long term, I should have a choice, and I should be able to say, no, I'm not stuck with your bad money. It's a trap. Americans and the world are literally trapped in this money, in this failing US dollar, not because the dollar has the best monetary properties that a money could ever have, but because they've trapped and shackled all of the monetary alternatives with taxes and regulation. You can't use gold and silver as money today, not because the gold standard failed or not because gold and silver don't make good money, but because they are unworkable as money, because they're shackled, they're burdened with all of these regulations and taxes. So to remove these disincentives, to remove all the briar and the brush, keeping people from, one, using this kind of money, and two, innovating within money, innovating and having entrepreneurs create different variations of money that have different properties. That is ultimately what we need in money. So this BRICS currency, it's just the first step to ultimately what's going to be a global market for money.
Well, one thing though, we're moving towards, let's say, CBDC, central bank digital currency. Some say we're even moving towards some type of universal basic income. And you had just mentioned, things like innovation, ingenuity, all of these things. These would probably be counterproductive to ingenuity, even freedom, should these things come into place.
Of course, you're absolutely right. The CBDC presents one of the biggest risks that the world has faced in a long time as far as privacy rights. And of course, as far as global engineering, of course, we talk about how this affects us individually. The idea that a government, if you say something foul or if you support a cause that the government doesn't want you supporting, the danger and risk of a government being able to turn off your bank account. Of course, this is extremely dangerous. We know the risks. We see them and acknowledge them as real because they have happened recently. The COVID, the truckers thing in Canada, where the Canadian government was shutting down people who simply donated to a GoFundMe. So like having incorrect opinions or thoughts according to the government can get you in hot water. And of course, this is a dangerous risk, but you have to look at it more globally as well. The risk is not contained to the individual. You're talking about macroeconomic engineering here. If I have a master bank account, if everyone has a master bank account at the central bank, I can impose negative interest rates. I can impose negative rates, a tax on savings. And this is how you speed up consumerism, this high velocity stuff that the American economy runs on, frankly, because it's not built on credit. It's not built on store value. It's not built on stability. It's built on consumerism and credit and debt. And that has to keep going for this economy to keep going. And so the risk for CBDCs is obviously massive. And this is something that we should be fighting. And as far as what we're doing on the state level, we're working with states to pass legislation to say that CBDCs are not money in any given state, that CBDCs cannot be forced upon people of a given state. And what you're saying about innovation is such an interesting, underappreciated point. When you think about money, the monetary monopoly that the United States has enjoyed for such a long time has kind of made it to where there hasn't really been any innovation in money in a long time. Dollars are what they are. And you have private businesses that are doing some of the digital payment stuff, your PayPals, your money transmitters, of course that. But money itself, as far as the base technology, we haven't really seen any innovation in this in a long time. And that's why removing some of this brush and some of the disincentives that stand in the way are so important, because I think, we're already seeing the fruits of our labor, by removing taxes on gold and silver as money. We've seen this great uptick in gold and silver being more available to the average American than they ever have been. So the Costco phenomenon, the Walmart phenomenon is indicative of that. But also you have things that we've never seen before, like the digital tokens. We're seeing digitized gold and silver on a blockchain. And, I don't know if those will work necessarily, but it's innovation. It's entering the battleground, the arena, and trying something. So we're seeing these sort of digital assets come up that are backed by gold. We're also seeing fractional stuff, 1,000-ounce gold bars. Gold is more affordable now by unit than for the individual than it has been, because we're able to use these technologies to make it more accessible. Gold backs are another example of a product that has innovated gold. You've got actual gold, grams of gold stored between two pieces of foil that are wrapped, and they have this great technology that literally makes it to where the bills that you carry in your wallet have gold in them. So the innovators, the entrepreneurs in this space are moving the ball towards making gold and silver more accessible. Oh, of course, Money Metals. You may have seen Money Metals last week or a couple weeks ago announced they are opening. They announced a $28 million gold depository, a brand new, larger than Fort Knox, giant precious metals depository. And I think Singapore or Silver Bullion recently opened one in Asia as well. Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
So these are indicative of, there are businesses out there that are saying there's a legitimate business case for storing precious metals. Not only do people want to buy and sell more gold and silver than they ever have, they're also talking about storing it in facilities. They're also talking about collateralizing it, using it for loans to tap into the liquidity of the metal. There are so many innovative ways that gold and silver are actively being remonetized. And I think a big part of that is, like I mentioned, removing the things that stand in the way from entrepreneurs being able to innovate in this space, but also the dollar's continued degradation. The politicians will continue to base the dollar. And if that's your base case, that inflation will continue, that the American empire will continue to grow, that wars will continue, that domestic policies will be overbloated and grossly expensive, if your base case is that all of that will continue, gold, silver, sound money, all of that has to be the most bullish bet on your mind right now.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% there, JP. Last question. I want to get back to your work there. So 2024, it was noted that 27 states considered more than 65 pieces of pro-gold and silver legislation.
Yeah, so this was in 2024, like I mentioned, not only was it the most successful year as far as projects that made it past the finish line, but also in question or in terms of states that are introducing this legislation in general, that they're even considering this legislation. And this is a variety of issues that this legislation purports to address. The taxes, like I mentioned, were a super important part of people using gold and silver as money. In our opinion, the single greatest impediment to people using gold and silver as money. But it's more than that. There are states that are considering bolstering their pension funds with gold and silver. There are states that, like you mentioned, have introduced legislation to do work on legal tender or reaffirming gold and silver as money, to reduce tax liability on the metals, to increase contractual protections in the case of contracts that were denominated in gold. If you and I were to make, for example, a 30-year long-term contract and we denominate it in gold, if there's a dispute and you take me to court or I take you to court, we'll go and the judge will say, okay, I find in favor of JP, but this contract here says something about $500,000 in gold. No. We're not going to do that. You'll use Federal Reserve notes, the U.S. legal tender, That's what we're going to use to pay this contract. And I would have to give you then US dollars. The judge could rule that I pay you in US dollars. But of course, we know that $500,000 in paper greenbacks and $500,000 worth of 999 pure gold are not the same thing. And so having legislation that ensures contractual protections that say, no, this contract calls, it is denominated in gold and silver, it should be repaid in gold and silver. This is a practice that used to be more common in the United States back, obviously, before 1913, before the government started its war on gold. Silver contracts and gold contracts were commonplace because they protect the lender and the borrower in a money that you can reliably know what it will be worth 30 years from now. Today, if you and I were to make a contract, a $500,000 contract over 30 years, the lender is at huge risk. You're paying me back in devalued dollars. 30 years from now, $500,000 might not be worth much at all. So it protects both sides of the contract. And so this is just one example of the many types of policy projects that we've pursued over the last 10 years. And then, of course, this year being our most successful year. And we're hopeful the next thing coming down to the pipe has to be to take out these remaining 5 states. In the remaining 5 states that still charge this sales tax: Hawaii, Kentucky, Maine, Vermont, and New Mexico. These are the holdouts that the vast majority of states have already proactively said, this is an outdated policy, we shouldn't be taxing money. But we have these 5 holdouts that haven't quite gotten it yet. So we will be sure, we'll be doubling down, we'll be devoting a lot of our efforts into making sure that that people across the United States, from sea to shining sea, are able to buy constitutional sound money, gold and silver, without any penalty from a state or federal government for doing so.
Yeah. Come on, Hawaii. You got to have some aloha and get rid of that tax. Come on. But JP, sorry, one last question here, because you made me think about when you said pensions. How about unions? Are unions starting to understand, like with their, say, annuities, that maybe they want to put some of these in silver and gold and precious metals?
That's an interesting question. It's honestly something that I haven't heard a ton about, but I know that there are people in this space that are working on this. I believe Larry Parks has an organization called FAME, the Future Advancement of Monetary Education, I believe it's called. And for a long time, Larry Parks has been writing about the importance of unions. And, because these are typically working people. These are blue collar people who are relying on these pensions to take them through retirement, because there is going to be no Social Security by the time they get there. But the reality is these unions, these pension funds are largely, part of it is that they're forecasting that they're going to get 9, 10, 11% returns year over year, which is unsustainable. When you're living in this high velocity, low interest rate environment, like what we've been living in the United States for so long, yeah, you can get comfortable with the idea of, 10% year over year, 13% year over year. Yeah, we can replicate that over and over. But when the easy money stops, when interest rates rise, and all of a sudden these returns aren't looking as good as they used to, some of these investments actually might turn out to be bad with real negative rates of return because of what inflation is. They're going to start thinking to themselves, man, maybe we should have owned a single ounce of gold. We should have had a single ounce of gold on our balance sheet. And frankly, when I think through, not necessarily unions, but when I think through to meetings that we've had, phone calls, email exchanges with state legislators back in 2017. In 2017, we had model legislation that would encourage a state to hold 1 to 2% of its state holdings in gold, held securely in the state, held in a contiguous state, however the treasurer wants to do it. But it would have compelled the state to hold 1% of its state holdings in gold. That was in 2017. We were ignored. We were mocked. The banking associations, the lobbyists came out and said, this is crazy. We don't know what they're talking about. Gold was $1,260 in 2017. Today, gold is sitting at around $2,700 an ounce. The politicians, the pundits, the lobbyists who mocked and derided this idea should be ashamed of themselves for being negligent in their fiduciary duty that they have to the state, to protecting the state reserves, and to the people of the state. This is a huge embarrassment, a huge stain on all of these legislators that did not think to invest state funds, to protect state funds with gold.
Absolutely. JP, we got to be more savage in these politicians already. But before we wrap up, can you let the people know how they can follow you on social media and, of course, how to support the Sound Money Defense League?
Absolutely. So you can follow me on Twitter, or X. My @ is @Jp Cortez 27. You can find our work on soundmoneydefense.org. We're regularly posting updates. I encourage anyone hearing this in the United States, if you're in one of these states that has active legislation actively going through it, I really encourage you to sign up for our mailing list. We send out emails, action alerts, whenever there's a key hearing or a key vote coming up. We include all the contact information and even a pre-written message for you to send to key members of the committee. And the truth is that more so than a powerful bill, more so than someone putting on a suit and going and testifying in front of these committees, the most powerful tool that we have to pass these pieces of legislation is by far, by and large, the grassroots efforts. It's the people in the state that we're able to mobilize and get them to contact their senators or their representatives. And that's ultimately what determines the outcome, the success, or the failure of these legislative projects. So I encourage everyone to sign up for our mailing list. We ask for your zip code so we can track it. And then in the case of a legislative project happening in your state, you would receive that state-specific action alert. Another thing I just want to quickly mention, we have two projects that one we're rolling out this year for the first time, but that I'd like to mention. We have a scholarship every year. Several years ago, I guess 8 years ago now, we put aside 100 ounces of physical gold. We teamed up with Money Metals to establish this scholarship. It's a gold-backed scholarship where we ask high school seniors, college students, and graduate students to enter in an essay contest. We have a blue ribbon panel of judges that are Austrian economists, free market economists, commentators, professors, and they will grade and rank your essays, and then there's a cash payment if you're chosen as one of our winners. So I encourage everyone to sign up for that. The deadline for that is October 31st, so just later this month is that deadline. And then the project that we're rolling out this year, a brand new project, we're calling it the Sound Money Fellowship. This is actually a project for advanced researchers. These are for graduate students, post-grad students, independent researchers who want to advance original sound money scholarship and analyses that will be published in a prestigious Sound Money Review sort of journal. So we're very excited to elevate the academia, the sort of scholarship and the thought leadership that's happening in sound money research. So we're very excited. That's another paid opportunity that we're giving researchers and students, an opportunity to study sound money, an opportunity to further research on sound money, and to, in their own voice, explain why sound money is important and why we need it.
JP Cortez, I want to thank you for what you and your organization is doing for younger people, for older people. I mean, the cause is so important right now, probably more than at any other point in our time. So I do appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Patrick. I'm such a huge fan of your channel. I appreciate you having me on again, and I appreciate you elevating so many great voices. I'm a regular watcher.
All right. Thank you, JP. I appreciate that. That was JP Cortez sharing his views on precious metals and the economy. To see more of JP's views and work, please go to www.soundmoneydefense.org. If you like this video, please do subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and share. All are greatly appreciated. Audio-only versions of this interview can be found on iTunes and Spotify.